This is my true story. I received a phone call from a stranger every Christmas night for 17 years, and it always happened at exactly 9 o'clock. The voice would whisper Merry Christmas and then hang up before I could say anything back. I thought it was some kind of cruel prank or maybe a wrong number that kept repeating every year. But on the 18th Christmas, the voice did not hang up, and instead, it said something that made my whole world stop. The voice said, "I am your son," and I almost dropped the phone because my wife told me our baby died 30 years ago. Before I tell you this story, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe so more people hear it. The first call came on Christmas night 17 years ago when I was sitting alone in my living room watching television. My wife had gone to bed early claiming she had a headache, and I was downstairs with a glass of whiskey trying to feel some kind of holiday spirit. The phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock, and I answered it, expecting it to be one of our relatives calling to wish us Merry Christmas. Instead, I heard a quiet voice that sounded young and male whisper, "Merry Christmas," and then the line went dead before I could respond. I thought it was a wrong number, or maybe some kids playing a prank on random people during the holidays. I hung up and went back to my television show and did not think about it again until the next Christmas, when the exact same thing happened. The phone rang at 9 o'clock on Christmas night, and the same quiet voice whispered Merry Christmas and hung up immediately. I tried to call the number back, but it was blocked, and I could not trace where it came from. This pattern continued every single Christmas for the next 15 years. Every year, on December 25th, at exactly 9 o'clock in the evening, my phone would ring. I would answer it and hear that same voice whisper Merry Christmas and then click off before I could ask who was calling or why they were doing this. The voice sounded like it belonged to a young man, but I could never be sure because the calls were so brief and the person spoke so quietly. I started to dread Christmas because of these calls. What should have been a joyful holiday became a source of anxiety as I waited for 9 o'clock to arrive and wondered if the mysterious caller would reach out again. My wife told me I was being paranoid and that I should just ignore it or change my phone number. But something about those calls bothered me in a way I could not explain. The voice did not sound threatening or malicious. It sounded sad and lonely and almost desperate. I tried everything to figure out who was calling me. I contacted the phone company and asked them to trace the number, but they said it was impossible because the caller was using some kind of blocking technology. I considered hiring a private investigator, but that seemed excessive for something that was probably just a harmless prank. I asked friends and family if they knew anyone who might be calling me as a joke, but nobody had any ideas. The calls became part of my Christmas routine in a strange way. I would spend the day with my wife going through the motions of celebrating, even though our marriage had been cold and distant for decades. We would exchange gifts neither of us wanted and eat dinner in silence, and then she would go to bed early like she always did. I would sit alone in the living room and wait for 9 o'clock to come. When the phone rang, I would answer it and hear those two words Merry Christmas and then silence. Sometimes I would try to keep the caller on the line by saying hello or asking who they were, but they always hung up immediately without responding. Sometimes I would not answer the phone at all, hoping that would make the call stop. But the next year, the phone would ring again at the same time, and I would give in and answer it because not knowing felt worse than hearing that mysterious voice. I started to wonder if the caller was someone from my past. Maybe it was an old friend or coworker playing an elaborate prank. Maybe it was someone I had wronged years ago, and this was their way of reminding me they still remembered. Maybe it was just a lonely person who had dialed my number by accident one year and then kept calling back out of habit or tradition. I never imagined those two words Merry Christmas carried the weight of a lifetime of longing. I never imagined the voice belonged to someone who had been searching for me for years. I never imagined that the stranger on the phone was not a stranger at all, but someone whose existence had been hidden from me by the person I trusted most in the world. On the 18th Christmas, I was sitting in my usual spot in the living room, waiting for 9 o'clock to arrive. My wife had already gone upstairs to bed, and I was alone with my thoughts and a drink that was not helping me feel any better. I had spent the day pretending to be happy, and pretending our marriage was not falling apart, and pretending that my life had turned out the way I hoped it would. The truth was, I felt empty and tired, and I was starting to wonder what the point of any of it was. The phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock, like it had for the past 17 years. I picked it up, expecting to hear those same two words, followed by immediate silence. But this time, something was different. The voice on the other end whispered "Merry Christmas" like always, but then instead of hanging up, there was a pause. I could hear breathing on the line, and I realized the caller was still there, waiting for something. I said hello and asked who was calling, and there was another long pause. I could hear the person on the other end struggling to speak, like they were trying to force words out but could not get them past their throat. I waited in silence, holding my breath, because I knew something important was about to happen. Then, the voice spoke again, and this time it was not a whisper. It was clear and trembling and filled with emotion that made my chest tighten. The voice said, "I am your son." And the words hit me like a physical blow. My hand started shaking so violently, I almost dropped the phone. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and my vision went blurry, and I had to sit down, even though I was already sitting. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out, because my brain could not process what I had just heard. The voice said it again, quieter this time, like the person was afraid I had not heard. "I am your son. I am your son." I finally managed to speak, and I said that was impossible because I did not have a son. I told the caller they had the wrong number, or they were confused, or they were playing some sick joke that was not funny. But the voice on the other end stayed calm and said, "No, there is no mistake. My name is Michael, and I am 30 years old, and you are my father. My biological father. The father my mother told me was dead. My wife had told me our baby died at birth 30 years ago. She told me she had gone into labor early, and there were complications, and the baby did not survive. She said it happened so fast, the doctors could not save him. She cried for weeks after, and I held her and mourned with her, and we never talked about it again because it was too painful. We never tried to have another child because she said she could not go through that kind of loss again. I believed her completely, and I carried that grief with me for 3 decades. But now this voice on the phone was telling me a completely different story. This voice was telling me the baby had not died. This voice was telling me I had a son who was alive and grown and had been searching for me. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me, and I could not tell which way was up anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my life was suddenly in question. I asked the voice to prove it and tell me something only my son would know. But then I realized that made no sense because I had never known my son, so how would I know what he should or should not know? The voice seemed to understand my confusion because he started talking and telling me things that made my blood run cold. He knew our old address from 30 years ago. He knew the name of the hospital where he was born. He knew my full name and my wife's full name and details about our life that no stranger could possibly know unless they had access to records that should have been sealed. He knew the lullaby I used to hum when my wife was pregnant because she had written it down in a journal the adoption agency gave him when he turned 18. Michael kept talking, and every word he spoke felt like a knife cutting through everything I thought was true about my life. He told me he had been raised by adoptive parents who loved him, but never hid the fact that he was adopted. When he turned 18, the state allowed him to access his original birth certificate and adoption records. That was when he learned his biological mother's name was Sarah, which was my wife's name. That was when he learned his biological father's name was mine. That was when he learned he had not been abandoned by 2 people who did not want him, but had been given away by a mother who made that choice alone. He said the adoption papers contained a statement from my wife explaining why she was giving up the baby. She had written that I was unfit to be a father because I was drowning in debt and had no steady income and no prospects for the future. She wrote that I was mentally unstable and could not provide a safe environment for a child. She wrote that giving the baby up for adoption was the only way to ensure he would have a good life, because staying with us would doom him to poverty and instability. Michael's voice broke when he told me this, and I could hear him crying on the other end of the phone. He said he had spent 12 years since he turned 18 trying to decide whether he should contact me. He said he was afraid I would be exactly the person his mother described in those papers. He was afraid I would be angry that he had found me, or that I would reject him, or that I would confirm all the terrible things written about me in those adoption documents. But he said he could not stop thinking about me and wondering what kind of man I really was. So he started calling me every Christmas, just to hear my voice. He would dial my number, and when I answered, he would listen to me say hello, and that was enough to tell him I was still alive. Then he would whisper Merry Christmas, because he wanted me to know someone was thinking about me, even if I did not know who it was. He would hang up quickly before I could ask questions because he was not ready to reveal himself yet. He told me things about our old life that shocked me because I had no idea my wife had kept such detailed records. He knew the song that played at our wedding because she had written it in her journal. He knew the color of the nursery I had painted when we found out she was pregnant. He knew the name we had picked out for the baby, which was Michael James, and that was the name his adoptive parents had kept when they finalized his adoption. All of these details proved he was telling the truth, but I still could not accept what I was hearing. I asked him where his mother had told him I was, and he said the adoption papers listed me as the father, but included a note saying I had abandoned the family before the birth. He said his mother had written that I left her when I found out she was pregnant because I did not want the responsibility of a child. She said I had disappeared and she had no way to contact me, and that was why she had to give the baby up alone. Every word was a lie, but it was documented in official papers that made it look like the truth. Michael said he did not believe those lies after he started researching me. He found records showing I had lived at the same address with my wife for years after his birth. He found evidence that I had not abandoned anyone. He realized his mother had lied in the adoption paperwork to make it easier to give him away. She had painted me as a deadbeat father who ran away when really I had been right there the whole time, completely unaware that my son even existed. He said the hardest part was not knowing why she lied. He said he understood she might have felt she could not raise him alone, but he could not understand why she told me the baby died instead of telling me the truth. Michael's voice was shaking as he explained what he had discovered when he dug deeper into the adoption records and tracked down people who knew my wife during that time. He said he had hired a private investigator 2 years ago to find out the real reason his mother gave him away. What the investigator uncovered was so much worse than anything Michael had imagined. My wife had been having an affair when she got pregnant, and she was not sure if I was the father or if her lover was the father. She decided to give the baby up for adoption to erase the evidence of her betrayal and protect her secret. Michael said the investigator had found the other man and interviewed him. The man admitted he had been involved with my wife for over a year before she got pregnant. He said my wife had told him she was going to leave me and be with him, but when she found out she was pregnant, everything changed. She became terrified that the baby would look like him instead of me, and that I would figure out what she had done. So she came up with a plan to get rid of the baby before anyone could ask questions. She told her lover she was going to tell me the baby died at birth, and then secretly give it up for adoption. She made him promise to end the relationship and never contact her again. She told him if he ever tried to reach out to her or claim the baby, she would destroy his marriage and his career. The man was married with children of his own, and he could not risk the scandal, so he agreed to disappear. He said he had thought about that baby every day for 30 years and wondered if it was his child, but he never had the courage to find out. Michael said the investigator also discovered that my wife had written in the adoption papers that I was unfit because she needed a legal reason to give the baby away without my consent. If she had listed me as a fit father, the adoption agency would have required my signature. But by claiming I was mentally unstable and financially irresponsible, she was able to sign the papers alone. She had destroyed my reputation in those documents to cover up her affair and get rid of a baby that might not even be mine. He told me he had taken a DNA test 6 months ago to find out if I was really his biological father. The results came back showing I was his father with 99.9% certainty. He said learning that truth had been both a relief and a source of rage. It meant his mother had not just lied about me being unfit. She had lied about everything. She had taken away my chance to be a father and taken away his chance to know me all, so she could hide the fact that she had been unfaithful during our marriage. Michael said the thing that hurt him most was knowing my wife had told him his father was a failure who could not provide for him. She had written in her journal that I had lost my business to debt and was struggling with bankruptcy around the time he was born. She made it sound like I was worthless and that giving him away was an act of mercy to save him from a life of poverty with a man who had nothing to offer. But Michael said he did not care if I had been poor or struggling. He said every child deserves to know their father, and I had been robbed of that choice. I sat there listening to all of this, and I felt my heart breaking in ways I did not know were possible. My wife had not just lied to me about our baby dying. She had destroyed my name in legal documents. She had stolen my son from me to protect herself from the consequences of her affair. She had let me grieve for a dead child, while that child grew up believing his father was a failure who had abandoned him. The cruelty of what she had done was so massive, I could barely comprehend it. I had lost my business to debt 5 years before Michael was born, and the failure had nearly destroyed me. I had started a small construction company with money I borrowed from family and friends, and for a few years it did well enough to support us. But then the economy crashed, and nobody was hiring contractors, and my clients started canceling projects and refusing to pay for work I had already completed. I tried to keep the business afloat by taking out loans and maxing out credit cards, but it was not enough. Eventually, I had to declare bankruptcy and close the company and admit that I had failed. My wife had been supportive at first, or at least that was what I thought at the time. She told me it was not my fault and that we would get through it together and that material things did not matter as long as we had each other. But I could see the disappointment in her eyes every time she looked at me. I could feel her pulling away from me emotionally, even though she was still physically present in our home. She stopped touching me and stopped talking to me about anything meaningful and started spending more time away from the house without explaining where she was going. When she told me she was pregnant, I was terrified because I had no idea how I would support a child. I was working odd jobs and barely making enough to pay rent and buy groceries. But I was also excited because I had always wanted to be a father. I had grown up without a good father figure in my life, and I promised myself that if I ever had children, I would be the kind of dad I never had. I would be present and loving and supportive, and I would teach my son or daughter everything I knew about being a good person. I spent months preparing for the baby, even though we had no money. I painted the nursery myself using leftover paint I got for free from a hardware store that was going out of business. I built a crib from scrap wood because we could not afford to buy one new. I read parenting books from the library and practiced changing diapers on dolls and tried to learn everything I could about taking care of an infant. My wife watched me do all of this with a strange expression on her face, like she pitied me or felt sorry for me. When she went into labor, I drove her to the hospital and waited outside the delivery room like they told me to do back then. After several hours, a doctor came out and told me there had been complications and the baby did not survive. He said my wife was resting and I could see her soon, but that I should prepare myself because she was devastated. I broke down crying in that hospital hallway and I felt like my entire world had collapsed. I had lost my business, and now I had lost my son, and I did not know how I was supposed to keep going. My wife came home from the hospital a few days later, and we never talked about what happened. She refused to discuss the baby or the delivery or anything related to that night. She said it was too painful and that talking about it would only make things worse. I respected her wishes because I did not want to cause her more suffering. I buried my grief and tried to be strong for her even though I was falling apart inside. I never knew my dream of being a father had been stolen from me and given away like unwanted baggage. I never knew my son was alive and growing up without me, while I mourned a death that never happened. I never knew that the woman I loved and trusted had looked at me and decided I was not good enough to raise our child. She had seen my financial struggles and my failed business and my desperate attempts to provide for our family, and she had judged me as worthless. She had decided our son deserved better than a father who had lost everything. Michael told me he had found the truth about his adoption when he turned 18, and the state allowed him to access his original birth records. He said seeing my name listed as his biological father had been shocking because he had always assumed both his birth parents had wanted nothing to do with him. But the records showed that only his mother had signed the adoption papers and that there was a note indicating the father had not been informed of the adoption. That note had given him hope that maybe I had not known about him, and maybe I would have wanted him if I had been given the choice. He spent months trying to decide what to do with this information. He was 18 years old and trying to figure out his own life, and suddenly he had this massive secret that his adoptive parents did not know about. He loved his adoptive parents and did not want to hurt them by searching for his biological family. But he also felt this overwhelming need to know where he came from and who his real father was. He said it felt like there was a piece of himself missing, and he would never be complete until he found me. He started searching for me online and found my address and phone number fairly easily. He drove by my house several times just to see where I lived and what kind of neighborhood I was in. He would sit in his car down the street and watch me come and go and try to imagine what it would be like to walk up to my door and introduce himself. But every time he got close to doing it, he would lose his courage and drive away. He was terrified I would reject him or tell him I did not want anything to do with him. So instead of confronting me directly, he decided to start calling me on Christmas. He chose Christmas because it was a holiday about family, and he wanted to feel connected to me, even if I did not know who he was. The first time he called, he had planned to tell me everything, but when he heard my voice answer the phone, he panicked and could only whisper Merry Christmas before hanging up. He felt foolish afterward, but also strangely comforted, because at least he had heard my voice and knew I was real. He kept calling every Christmas for the next 17 years. He said those calls became a ritual that kept him going when he felt lost or alone. No matter what else was happening in his life, he knew that on December 25th at 9 o'clock, he would dial my number and hear my voice. Sometimes I would just say hello and wait for him to speak. Sometimes I would ask who was calling or tell him to stop playing games. But he never had the courage to say anything beyond Merry Christmas until this year. He said he finally decided to reveal himself because his adoptive mother had passed away 6 months ago, and it made him realize life was too short to keep hiding. His adoptive father had died when Michael was 23, so now both of his adoptive parents were gone. He said losing them had made him feel completely unanchored and alone in the world. He realized he needed to find his biological family, or he would spend the rest of his life wondering what could have been. He also said he had gotten married 2 years ago, and his wife had just given birth to their first child 3 months ago. Becoming a father himself had changed something inside him. He said holding his own son for the first time made him think about me and wonder what I had felt when I thought I lost him. He said his wife had encouraged him to reach out to me and stop torturing himself with these anonymous phone calls. She told him he deserved to know his real father and that I deserved to know I had a son. So he made the call like he did every Christmas, but this time he forced himself to stay on the line and tell me the truth. He said his hands were shaking and his heart was pounding, and he almost hung up like always. But then he thought about his newborn son and how he would feel if someone took that child away from him, and he found the courage to speak. We agreed to meet 3 days after that Christmas phone call at a diner halfway between our houses. I barely slept during those 3 days because my mind would not stop racing. I kept thinking about what Michael had told me and trying to process 30 years of lies and stolen time. I wanted to confront my wife immediately and scream at her and demand to know how she could have done something so cruel. But I decided to wait until after I met Michael because I needed to see him first and confirm with my own eyes that he was real and that this was not some elaborate scam or mistake. I arrived at the diner 30 minutes early because I was too anxious to wait at home any longer. I sat in a booth by the window and watched every car that pulled into the parking lot, wondering if one of them contained my son. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee cup. I felt sick to my stomach and I could not eat anything even though I had not eaten in 2 days. I kept rehearsing what I would say to him, but every time I tried to imagine the conversation, my mind went blank. When Michael walked through the door, I knew it was him immediately, even though I had never seen a picture of him. He had my eyes and my nose and the same shape of face I saw every time I looked in the mirror. He was tall and thin with dark hair, and he moved with a hesitant, awkward energy, like he was not sure he belonged in the space he was occupying. He looked around the diner nervously until his eyes landed on me, and then he froze. We stared at each other for what felt like forever before he finally walked over to my booth and sat down across from me. Neither of us could speak at first. We just sat there looking at each other with tears running down our faces. I reached across the table and grabbed his hand, and he grabbed mine back, and we held on to each other like we were both drowning. His hand felt exactly like mine, with the same long fingers and the same rough calluses from years of working with tools. I could see myself in every feature of his face, and it was like looking at a photograph of myself from 30 years ago. When we finally started talking, the words came out in a confused, jumbled rush. I told him I had no idea he existed and that his mother had lied to me and said he died at birth. He told me he had always felt like something was missing in his life, even though his adoptive parents had loved him. I told him about the nursery I painted and the crib I built and how I had spent months preparing to be a father. He told me about the 17 years of Christmas phone calls and how hearing my voice had been the only connection he had to me. We talked for hours, and neither of us could eat anything on our plates. The waitress kept coming by to refill our coffee and give us concerned looks, but we ignored her. I asked Michael about his life, and he told me about his adoptive parents and his childhood and his wife and his new baby. He showed me pictures on his phone, and I stared at my grandson and felt this overwhelming mix of joy and rage. Joy that I had a family I did not know about, and rage that 30 years had been stolen from me. Michael asked me about my life, and I told him about my failed business and my struggling marriage and how I had spent 3 decades believing I was a father who lost his child. I told him his mother had let me grieve for a baby that never died, and I told him about the empty nursery I could not bring myself to dismantle for years. I told him I had always wanted a son, and that losing him had broken something inside me that never healed. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "You were not a failure, and she was wrong to say that about you in the adoption papers." And I went home that night and found my wife sitting in the living room watching television, like it was just another normal evening. She looked up when I walked in and asked where I had been because I had left the house early that morning without telling her. I stood in the doorway staring at her and feeling rage building inside me so intense I was afraid of what I might do. She must have seen something in my face because she turned off the television and asked what was wrong. I told her I had met our son today, and I watched her face go completely white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stood up from the couch and stumbled backward, like I had physically struck her. She kept shaking her head and saying that was impossible, and asking what I was talking about. I pulled out my phone and showed her the pictures Michael had sent me of himself and his family. I showed her a photo of our grandson, and I said, "This is what you threw away 30 years ago when you decided I was not good enough to be a father." She started crying and trying to explain, but I cut her off. I told her I knew about the affair and the lies in the adoption paperwork and the decision she made to erase our child from our lives. I told her Michael had hired a private investigator and uncovered everything, including the name of the man she had been sleeping with. I said I knew she had given away our baby to hide her betrayal and protect her secret, and that she had let me believe the baby died so I would never ask questions. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, and admitted everything. She said yes, she had an affair, and yes, she was not sure who the father was when she got pregnant. She said she panicked when she realized the baby might not be mine, and she could not risk me finding out. She said giving the baby up for adoption had been the only way to make the problem go away without destroying our marriage. She said she had been planning to tell me the truth eventually, but then weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and it became easier to just keep the lie going. I asked her how she could have done that to me and to our son. I asked her how she could have watched me grieve for a dead child while knowing he was alive and growing up without me. I asked her how she could have written in legal documents that I was unfit and unstable and incapable of providing for a family. She said she had to write those things to get the adoption approved without my consent. She said she knew it would hurt me if I ever found out, but she never thought I would find out because sealed adoption records were supposed to stay sealed forever. She tried to justify what she had done by saying I had nothing to offer a child back then. She said I was drowning in debt from my failed business and working minimum wage jobs and barely keeping us afloat financially. She said she looked at me and saw a man who could not provide the kind of life she wanted for herself or for a baby. She said giving the baby away had been an act of mercy because raising him in poverty would have been cruel. Her words confirmed what I had always feared she believed about me, that I was worthless in her eyes, and that my love was not enough to make up for my financial failures. I told her she had no right to make that decision alone and that she had stolen 30 years from me and from Michael. I told her she had destroyed any chance of our son knowing his real father during his childhood and that damage could never be undone. I told her the man she described in those adoption papers was not me, but rather the man she wanted me to be, so she could justify giving away our child. She had turned me into a villain in her own mind to make herself feel less guilty about what she had done. My wife moved out within a week and went to stay with her sister in another state. She could not face Michael or me or the truth of what she had done. She left a note saying she was sorry and that she hoped someday I would understand why she made the choices she made. But there was no understanding or forgiving what she had done. She had looked at me during the worst period of my life, when I was struggling and broken and desperate, and she had decided I was not worthy of being a father. She had judged me and found me lacking and thrown away our child like he was garbage. I filed for divorce 2 weeks after she left, and she did not contest it. Our marriage had been dead for years anyway, held together only by routine and the absence of a reason to officially end it. Now we had a reason that could not be ignored. She had built our entire relationship on a foundation of lies and betrayal, and there was no coming back from that. The divorce was finalized within 6 months, and I never spoke to her again after she moved out. She sent a few emails trying to explain herself further, but I deleted them without reading them. Michael stayed in contact with me throughout all of this. He called me every few days to check on me and make sure I was okay. He invited me to his house to meet his wife and his baby, and I went, even though I was terrified of intruding on his life. His wife was kind and welcoming, and she told me she was glad Michael had finally found me. She said he had been carrying the weight of not knowing his biological father for so long, and that meeting me had lifted something heavy off his shoulders. I held my grandson for the first time and felt emotions I could not name. This tiny baby was my flesh and blood, and I had not even known he existed until a few weeks ago. I thought about all the moments I had missed with Michael and all the milestones I would never get back. His first steps and his first words and his first day of school and his graduation and his wedding. All of it had happened without me because his mother decided I did not deserve to be there. Michael seemed to sense what I was thinking because he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We cannot get back the past, but we can build a future." He said he did not blame me for not being there because I had not known about him. He said the only person responsible for the lost years was his mother, and that he had made peace with that, even if he had not forgiven her. He said he wanted me in his life now, and he wanted his son to know his grandfather, and that was what mattered. We were strangers, learning to be family, and it was awkward and difficult at first. We did not have 30 years of shared memories or inside jokes or comfortable familiarity. We had to start from scratch and build something new. But the foundation was there, built on 17 years of Christmas phone calls that said, "I never stopped looking for you." Michael had reached out to me every single year, even when he was too afraid to identify himself. He had kept that connection alive with 2 words whispered into the phone, and then silence. I realized those phone calls had been his way of telling me he existed, and that he was thinking about me even when I did not know who he was. He had been trying to find the courage to reveal himself, and every Christmas he got a little bit closer. By the time he finally said, "I am your son," he had been preparing for that moment for nearly 2 decades. He had spent half his life searching for me and building up the strength to face potential rejection. His mother had told him I was a failure, but he had reached out anyway. She had told him I was unfit and unstable, but he had taken the risk of contacting me and finding out for himself. We spent the next Christmas together, and it was the first time in 18 years that my phone did not ring at 9 o'clock. Michael was sitting right next to me in my living room, holding his son, and we did not need phone calls anymore because we were finally together. His wife had made dinner, and we all sat around the table like a real family. It felt strange and uncomfortable at first because we were still learning how to be around each other. But as the evening went on, I started to feel something I had not felt in decades. I felt like I belonged somewhere, and that my life had purpose beyond just surviving from one day to the next. Michael brought photo albums showing me pictures of his childhood and his teenage years and all the moments I had missed. I looked at images of him as a little boy and tried to imagine what it would have been like to raise him and teach him and watch him grow up. His adoptive parents looked like good people in the photographs, and I was grateful he had been loved and cared for, even if it should have been me doing those things. He told me stories about his childhood and his adoptive father who had taught him how to fix cars, and his adoptive mother who had made him feel safe and valued. I showed him pictures of the nursery I had painted before he was born, and the crib I had built that I kept in storage for years because I could not bring myself to throw it away. I showed him the baby name book I had used to choose his name, and the spot where I had written Michael James in pencil, next to a list of other possibilities. He started crying when he saw that, because his adoptive parents had kept the name Michael, even though they did not know it was the name I had chosen for him. He said it felt like fate, or some kind of cosmic connection that had kept us tied together even when we were separated. We talked about his mother and what she had done and how we both felt about it. Michael said he had tried to contact her after he found me, but she refused to speak to him. She sent him a letter saying she was ashamed of her choices and that she did not deserve his forgiveness. She said giving him away had haunted her for 30 years, but she had convinced herself it was the right thing to do at the time. She said she hoped he had a good life and that she was sorry for all the pain she had caused. Michael said he did not know if he would ever forgive her, but he was trying to let go of the anger because holding on to it was only hurting himself. I told him I understood that struggle because I was dealing with the same thing. Part of me wanted to hate his mother forever for what she took from me. But another part of me knew that hatred would only poison whatever time I had left. I had already lost 30 years, and I did not want to lose more by dwelling on the past. Michael nodded and said that was exactly how he felt. He said we both deserved to move forward and build something new instead of staying trapped in the grief of what was stolen. My grandson started crying and Michael picked him up and handed him to me. I held that tiny baby and felt his weight in my arms, and I thought about all the dreams I had when I was preparing to be a father 3 decades ago. Those dreams had been taken from me, but now I was getting a second chance. I was getting to be a grandfather and watch my son be the father he deserved to be. It was not the same as raising Michael myself, but it was something precious and real, and I was grateful for it. Michael looked at me holding his son, and he said quietly, "You were not a failure, Dad. You were just a man who loved someone who could not see your worth. But I see it now." Those words broke something open inside me, and I started crying, and I could not stop. For 17 years, a stranger had called me every Christmas and hung up without explaining why. Now, I knew it was not a stranger at all. It was the son my wife stole from me trying to find the father she said was not good enough. And he had found me and decided I was worth knowing after all.